Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today we have a conversation coming up about migration. And as you probably are aware, immigration is one of the big hot button issues of the day, not only in the US, although certainly especially in the US. And migration worldwide seems to be one of the issues that has provoked a lot of those folks who are, I guess we can call them right wing populist movements around the world. And so we have to think very broadly about what the transfer of population from one region of the world to another is going to mean to us in the future, and what it already is meaning in terms of politics of different countries. And uh, this today, I'm going to have a conversation with, I have to say, a woman I've known since she was about what, 8 years old.
Mhm.
A very dear friend, Subha Xavier, who's in Atlanta. And hi, Suba. How are you, dear?
Hello, I'm well, thank you. How are
Wonderful.
you?
Great, great. Excellent, because I'm so thrilled at what you have accomplished. You and your friends in Atlanta have recently accomplished by going out and going door to door and inducing voters to. I think you say you found people whose ballots had been invalidated
hmm
and took it to them and said, "Straighten, let's clean this up so you can vote."
hmm hmm
So you won. Yeah.
We did. It was really exciting. They call it curing ballots, which I think I love that word because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And
Huh?
I said at some point, I said on social media that I was happy to be part of any type of cure in this current climate. So yeah, we were knocking on doors and helping people correct and cure their ballots. And I
Uh,
think it made a difference in the end.
sure did. You got two senators who are Democrats who are
hmm
going to the new Congress,
hmm
and that was I must say I went to bed at something like 12:30 or 1 o'clock, feeling fairly happy about the result of that. And then I didn't watch the news again for almost 24 hours, or at least a number of hours. And in the meantime, what had happened was this insurrection in the Capitol. So it's almost as if this extremely important piece of news about what had been accomplished in Atlanta got sidelined by the more photogenic activities that were going on at the Capitol building. Yeah.
I
Um,
think that's a good way to put it, sort of photogenic. What is photogenic these days? What do we like to see and what attracts our attention and our news
I mean,
cycle?
it's not just today. It's always
Yeah,
been blood and guts.
yeah,
What
yeah.
do they say? That if it bleeds, it leads.
hmm
But it is important. I in no way want to dismiss the extreme importance of this insurrection. But what you did is also really commendable, you
And
folks.
I think it's important to make the connection between the two. I do think that many people on both sides knew Georgia was going blue. All the signs were pointing towards it. The numbers were pointing towards it. The polls were pointing towards it. Everyone on the ground knew we had enough registered Democratic voters to win this election and this runoff. And I cannot we cannot underestimate the importance of that news and the impact of that news on the people who decided that insurrection was the way to go. Because I think what we saw was people terrified of the change that is coming and wanting to hold on to a status quo that you and I both know cannot last.
Mhm.
Just cannot last. And so I think Georgia was a key component in the motivations of these people. I
Well,
really do think that they
do you
were
think it will
unaware.
stick? Because some of the pundits that I was watching said, "Well, it's a wonderful fluke, but Georgia is still a red state and hasn't changed." Now I don't know what that means, except that they obviously don't believe that in the future it will necessarily predict further move toward the
And
left.
honestly, I think they're wrong. I think Georgia, in its population and its demographics, has changed drastically in the last 10 years. And I think largely that's because of Black voters coming out to vote and feeling for the first time that they are not disenfranchised, that they can make a difference. But
I
most
think
importantly, I think it's.
I think you're touching something that bangs on your mic.
Oh,
I don't know whether you're. I don't know what you're doing, but there's a sound. Anyway, I can.
But I do think it's there's huge immigrant populations that have moved to the Atlanta area and the surrounding areas, and let's face it, that the election was won because of the Atlanta counties and the counties surrounding us. It was not won in those other counties all around. Atlanta is hugely populated, and we made the difference, and that population is not going anywhere. So at best, I would say it's a purple state, but I am actually confident because of the effort of people like Stacey Abrams and Tamika Atkins and others who've been kind of grassroots, just working nonstop for the last 10 years. I think they have actually changed this state.
Wow.
To blue. I really do believe we're more than purple. But, for the pundit's sake, I will say, okay, maybe we're purple then, but we're certainly no longer red. Mm-hmm. I think they got that wrong.
Okay, well, okay. And another factor has to do with, you've already pointed to the rural-urban differential. I was looking at exit polls, and these huge gap between rural and urban in preference for Biden or the person whose name will not be uttered.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's very true. When we were carrying ballots and volunteering, they were constantly asking us if we would drive out to other further away counties to do this kind of work, to try to make sure that those ballots counted. So I think that's really important because, yes, the urban population of Georgia is perhaps more inclined to vote red and has always been inclined to vote Republican, but there always and continue to be Democrats in the rural populations as well. And if we were asked to be volunteers there, it's because they're there and they're feeling heavily disenfranchised. And I was just over New Year's Eve, I was actually in Hancock County, which going there, as I looked around, I was convinced it must be a very white county. And yet I found out it was most majoritively Black. So you have these rural counties that are also very African-American, and where people maybe just didn't vote or didn't feel like their vote counted or are intimidated when they go to the polling stations. And it was on the national news, suddenly because Georgia was on CNN, we got that on the national news. And we saw, in fact, that a place like Hancock County, completely rural, beautiful, but completely rural and very kind of disengaged, you would think, from federal and state politics, is not. And that there are, in fact, all these Democratic voters waiting to vote and waiting to be enabled to vote. And I think that was one of the big changes we saw.
That's good news. And now you said, I believe, that the votes that had been thrown out as not eligible somehow, and I'd be interested in knowing more about what disqualified a particular ballot, but that they were disproportionately Black votes, Black ballots. Okay, so you were pursuing Black voters mostly, right?
In the vast majority, yeah, and it was the experience was very gratifying, but it was also very sad. Many of the voters whose ballots we cured were elderly people who were sick and whose signature, maybe because their hands were shaking, their signature on the ballot what didn't match with their original signature when they registered to vote. Who knows how many years ago, decades ago, perhaps. Some of them, the saddest ones, were people who'd gone blind since they'd registered to vote, and they'd had to have somebody help them with their signature. Now, what they didn't know is that they could have had somebody sign in their place, but these things are not necessarily very legible on a ballot. You don't, you might have to do your research to know. So you don't do that. You are blind and you just, somebody tells you, here's the line, sign on this line. You don't sign properly, or you don't sign in the exact match for the way you signed before, and the ballot was invalidated. So yeah, the vast majority were Black. The vast majority that ballots that I cured were also Black women. There were also a lot of young people, like 18-year-olds of every ethnic background, who were just neglectful with the way they did their ballot, and who just kind of threw it in there, and who we had to go help because their signature wasn't matching, or they had not, colored in the circle properly. So it was kind of the two extremes. But yes, I think the vast majority of voters who needed their ballots cured were, at least in my experience, and this is of course anecdotal, were Black. And I will also say that when they saw me at the door versus my husband at the door, who is white skinned, and when they saw me, they would open the door. But whenever we would go together, they wouldn't open the door. So we figured out that he needed to stay in the car and I needed to go to the door. And I would sometimes take one of my kids and they would, open the door. They were so again, that also shows you something about just fear and trust, and the sense that these are voters that have been disenfranchised their entire lives and they don't know who to believe anymore. And the fact that we had leaders on the ground whose only goal was to bring them back in, was just inspiring. And like you said, before, I think this needs to be part of the news cycle, and it's not sufficiently in the news cycle, and we need to be talking about this. And I do think these kind of things scare white supremacist voters more than anything else, when we empower the very people who they believe have sort of taken away their power, their so-called power, right? Their imagined power, really.
Have you run into hostility from, say, neighbors who didn't like what you were doing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very careful. I live kind of in a suburb in Georgia and in Atlanta, and I'm very careful. I didn't leave my house for 5 days after the election, not even to walk my dog. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe after Biden's election. I didn't feel safe because of the way people look at me, and the way I get kind of stared down. And there's
isn't you say brown skin? Well, is it that, or is it that they saw you with a Biden sign or something, and they and realized what you were doing and didn't like it?
Well, we have Biden and Warnock and Ossoff signs in our yard. We have more importantly, we have Kamala Harris signs in our yard. We have so yes, I think it's all of that. I think yes, we had huge curing. When you cure ballots, you have all this paperwork that is very clearly Democrat. So yeah, I was very careful. I'm just aware. I do get stares. I get racist slurs, at least regularly, I would say. I think we live in a time and a state that is more openly racist, and when people who are racist were kind of given
permission,
right?
Mm-hmm.
This is why I think he who we shall not name is profoundly responsible, because he has really emboldened people to do and say things that ordinarily they never would. There's a part of me that thinks, well, I would rather them out themselves than not, because in some ways when they out themselves, it's not only I who see it, but others see it around me as well. And that's important, right? There's so much racism that is kind of hidden behind closed doors that we see, for example, in the academy all the time, right? All the ways in which racism is something we experience, and yet we don't show it, we don't speak it out loud. So there is, to me, a part of the way in which this particular administration has emboldened people to speak their prejudice out loud. Part of me has been relieved by that, because at least it's for all ears to hear and all eyes to see, and not only targeted this very kind of pointed, careful way at people like me or look like me. So I do, I an optimist. I really am. And an optimist means that I see all this as leading to some greater good. I sort of think that even this kind of insurrection is I like the fact that we all got to see it, because otherwise it's often people like me who see it. But here it was the whole world. They all got to glance on it for, I don't know how long it went on because I didn't watch it. But they watched it, and I think it's great that they watched it. I think that is exactly what you need. Watch it and realize that this is what goes on in this country every single day.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether to say it's a blessing to me, but because I never see it, I would never. And when, I think your mother said that, yes, she encounters it. And I was startled, that was a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Racism here in Toronto, what happens? I don't see it.
Yeah.
And I'm always astonished
Yeah.
when it occurs. Yeah. And by the way, you said you take your one of your two children to the door of a Black family, and they'll let you in.
I take both of them. Yes.
But if they were blonde, would it make any difference?
I don't know. That's a good point. I mean, I think children are less intimidating no matter what. So I think that there's something, when you see a woman with a child, you don't think that they're here to somehow intimidate you, right?
Okay,
so I think,
now these families that you're going to the door, they don't see you as Black. You're Sri Lankan. So they must know that you're not Black, but what do they think of you? But you say it helps that you have...
I think it does, because I single-handedly cured more ballots than most of the volunteers, I mean, and it just happened that way. It wasn't planned.
Well,
it wasn't,
God, you're also a forceful personality,
Yeah, yes, but at the same time, I think, I'm a less intimidating presence at a door. And I don't blame them for it, because if I was alone at home and somebody knocked on the door, in suburban Georgia, I mean, I think twice before opening the door. If I, so, so I do think that has something to do with it. Yeah, I don't know if necessarily they know what my ethnic identity is per se, but I think seeing a small brown woman at your door is just, quite frankly, less intimidating.
Okay.
And I think it tells you a little more about sort of racial climate in the state than anything else.
Okay, let's talk more generally about that, because part of the explanation you've already given is that lots of migrants are coming into Georgia. And I understand that there's a significant change enough of a change in the demographics of the whole state to really make a difference. So who are these migrants? Where are they coming from? And what do they have in common? Or are they similar enough to even say they have anything in common? Politically, what can we say about the migrants around your part of the world? And maybe not. I know you also lived in Miami before you moved to Atlanta. I should have introduced you properly by saying that you teach French and Francophone studies and migrant studies at Emory University in Atlanta, which is an excellent university, and populated by excellent professors such as yourself. And I'm very proud of you. So,
thank you.
How you can, even if you want to, say what's different about Miami and Atlanta as you move from one to the other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, I think what we are witnessing in this country is the growing political presence of immigrant populations. And I think that's really important to frame that way. That immigrant populations, this is a country of immigrants. You'll hear that being said all the time. And Canada is a country of immigrants as well. Most countries in the West are today more and more and increasingly countries of immigrants. So they have always been there, but now slowly they are becoming political presence. And by that I mean their vote is swaying the way large groups of people are voting. And I do think that in Atlanta, what's really unique to the Atlanta region is that it is a majoritarily Black African American Atlanta region, and then all these suburban and sort of rural areas that are less, and other cities that are less Black overall, right? Even though, like I said, I think that that demographic too has to be revisited. And then you have mostly to the major urban areas, to the urban centers, you have immigrants who have been pouring in for the last, easily 30 years in significant numbers. So yes, they've been here all along, but in significant numbers. I would say that maybe in the last 30 to 40 years, that has changed dramatically.
Where are they from?
So they're, I think, from everywhere. But what we have in Atlanta, we have a growing Hispanic population, not at all comparable to what we have in Miami, but a growing Hispanic population from various parts of Latin America. Significantly, I would say that I have noticed in my work with migrants in the city that we have a growing population of Puerto Ricans, that we have a growing population of Mexicans, that we have a growing population of Venezuelans, we have Salvadorans. So we have, I would say overall, and of course Brazilians, have always been a lot of Brazilians in Atlanta as well. Indians have often been attracted
again, or something. Something is bumping the mic.
Oh, the microphone. I'm sorry. It shouldn't, but.
Well, okay. I don't know what's happening. So anyway, I can edit it out, but
yeah. And then of course, Indians, there's a huge Indian population here, and has always been one. And then there's a significant African population here that's growing, that I've been working with through my work at Emory as well, from Sudan, from Rwanda, from the Congo. And then there's the Asian population, a great big population of Vietnamese, Koreans. There's a whole area that's very close to where we live called Beaufort Highway. It's kind of known as the immigrant part of Atlanta. And it's known for its incredible cuisine, you have every possible restaurant and supermarket, and you can get any Asian food possible in these areas, but they're also very Latin. It's also very Hispanic and Latinx. And that too is these are populations that have been very important and growing in the Atlanta area. So I think it's incredible in that you have this diversity of populations. What they have in common, well, everything and nothing, right? I mean, like all of us, what they have in common is that they're relatively newcomers, that they have all the issues that immigrants face from one generation to the other, this dramatic difference in the way they are integrated into life from one generation to the other. I'm, obviously one of those cases in point. My work talks a lot about how they are caught between what I call resistance and exploitation. They're both exploited for their labor, for what they can bring, their cuisine, all the wonderful ethnic things that they bring, and they enrich our lives. And then they're exploited at the same time and they're treated with prejudice. And so they're always kind of resisting and at the same time looking to integrate. And in some ways they're accused of selling out because some of them integrate so much. And they're accused of betrayal because they leave behind cultural, language. They leave behind cultural practices. Sometimes they leave behind religion, and these things are often deemed unforgivable. This is what the literature taught. I mean, I'm a professor of literature and film. This is what the art
introduce you that way too. I didn't properly say that your research has to do with the literary production of people into Francophone countries from elsewhere, from non-Francophone countries.
Absolutely.
All of them are migrants, and you're dealing with migrant literature.
Yes.
In fact, I think the title of your book refers to the word migrant, doesn't it?
Yes, it's the migrant text, making and marketing a global French literature. And so, it's really about how this literature, and their cultural production gives us real insight into the ways in which they inhabit the spaces and all the spaces, right? The political spaces, but also the cultural spaces and the economic spaces. And I think what they have in common is the way in which they're constantly negotiating different cultures, different languages, different expectations, and different politics. I mean, I listened to when you had Maria Puerta Rivera on your show, and I enjoyed it because indeed that's exactly what she's talking about, kind of negotiating politics between Trump and Guido, and just kind of where they land is interesting, because she actually said they kind of turn into pretzels of sort. And I thought, what a wonderful image, because I truly think that's what it's like to be a migrant. You're kind of pretzeling your body around to try to meet all these different expectations and all these different standards that are held up to you, and invariably you're going to fail to meet somebody's standard and somebody's expectation, right? And I think that's what they share in common.
Well, you also have taught in Paris. Your university sends you as kind of a mother hen, along with some students, to spend a year or two in Paris, and you were there recently. And I believe that then you have a really good opportunity to compare what migration is like for the people landing in Paris to the situation of people landing in Atlanta or Miami. Is there a difference in the way France treats migrants? They've certainly had some disturbing riots and just events, protest movements of I guess mostly North African immigrants to France in the past years. I'm not sure that I've heard of any in the last 2 or 3 years. But at any rate, is there anything you can say about how different countries process immigrants, and whether it makes any difference in their experience?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, no two countries seem to handle immigrants alike. But I do think there's always a populist, extreme right-wing version of immigration that many of these countries share, as we know. England, the US, Canada to some extent, and certainly France and Germany. I mean, they all have, there's always a right-wing extremist narrative of belonging and nationhood that always needs the migrants. This is something I write about, in that nationalism and migrant populations go together, right? When migrant populations increase, nationalism increases. And I think what's important to note is that the story that each tells goes alongside with it. So the migrant story and the story of immigration goes alongside with the story of the nation story. And the nation story is one that has to make sense of the migrant. They have to either dissolve them into themselves, or they have to posit them as the enemy. And as you see today, that is often how it works. So that framework, that, if I can call it a narrative framework, is true, I think, across the board. In terms of that extreme national narrative or nationalist narrative, and sort of the migrants, where the migrants, but the immigrant is always part of that narrative. And I think that's telling. That's telling, because it tells you that immigrants are sort of the unresolvable problem to the nation state as we have
you're discouraging me, because your simple equation is an obvious one, but I never actually put it that simply. Where you have immigration, you have nationalism. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. Is that always true?
In all the cases I've studied, it's been true. I mean, it's just a numbers game. Like nationalist rhetoric increases. I mean, even in Quebec, it was true, because I studied Quebec as well. And even in Quebec, it was true, because the 70s was this key moment in Quebec nationalism. And 70s is when the immigrant population just went like this. They were next to non-existent till that time. They were very small, and suddenly they became a presence. And again, when you have this presence that you can't quite dissolve, you
Yeah,
can't.
but you're making me unhappy because that if you say that generally holds up, the future is not too bright because with global warming, we're going to have a whole lot more migration. We're going
Mhm.
to have multiple times as much migration as we have now. I mean, the whole country of Bangladesh is going to have to evacuate, for example,
Right.
and et cetera. And these Maldives and these islands in the Pacific and so on are going to be inundated, and God knows where else. I think Lower Manhattan is going to have to evacuate. So,
Florida is going to be non-existent, but
in
yeah.
Florida, exactly. So all of these populations are going to be on the move big time. And I hadn't thought about that there's sort of like an equation that you can calculate how much nationalism you're going to have. It doesn't sound very pleasant. I hope you're wrong, but but maybe it holds up. I don't know. I never thought about it quite that way. Um,
I do. That is my prediction. Like I will stand by it. I really do think, and whether or not we are comforted or discomforted by that reality, I think we need to be aware of that reality. I think we need to, and we need to respond to that reality. I think in places like the U.S., what's fascinating is to look at Georgia as a really good example of what that means politically, because what you have is, if you have more and more migrants in a place like Georgia, well, they're going to vote differently. And they're going to be a different kind of political entity. And that also, to me, brings with it some hope. I'm not saying that immigrants don't contribute to nationalist thinking, because they do. And we've witnessed it. I mean, we know that immigrants did vote for Trump. I think that's an important thing to say. I think we know that immigrants do vote with the right wing.
well, there's another thing though that moves in a somewhat different. Your equation has to be is sort of modified in that I've talked to Doug Saunders about this because he writes about migration, and he, if I'm not misquoting him, I think he really would say that where the opposition to migrants is located is not where the migrants are. In other words, where they actually settle, the people around them become okay. They handle it pretty well. It's the people some distance away, uh, maybe in localities where there are no migrants that display the greatest amount of bigotry.
Mhm.
So is um, so maybe as more migrants come, they have a better chance of winning the narrative. I mean, their narrative has a better prospect. Is would you want to say that or not?
Well, I think unfortunately, this is what I was trying to say. I don't think it's that simple, because some of them are, if I can use the word, almost co-opted into the other narrative, right? In other words, and let's not forget that. I think that's important, because we don't all invest in a great majority. For example, in the US, immigrants tend to vote Democrat, great majority. But let's not forget those who don't. There's been a lot of writing about that recently, and I'm writing about that as well right now. It's just, I think it's important to note that there's some percentage of them who do not vote.
And Maria was pointing out that the Venezuelans
Exactly.
be exactly those people. They supported Trump.
Absolutely.
Which doesn't make really much sense because they're
I know, and I appreciated that she problematized that, because I think we need to do more of that kind of work. We need to show how ultimately it's so contradictory, and it's really not rational. And I don't think there's anything about nationalism that is rational. Let's face it. It is kind of this gut reaction and this way of voting. I think I told you earlier that the first Trump signs that came out in my neighborhood were from the Korean family, and that was a very disturbing thing for me and my children. I mean, my kids were just trying to understand that. They were trying to process, but mom, like, these are not the people you said vote for Trump. How can this be? And then we've had to process it as a family. These are our neighbors. And what does it mean to be the first to bring out the signs? That's also really key, I think. They're saying this is where we stand. And what are they saying in that this is where we stand? You may see a Korean American coming out of my door, but this is who we are. That I think is really important. And that population is not going to go away. And the Republicans, if they're smart, will actually capitalize on those populations. And they right now, we know, are Cuban, we know they're Venezuelan. There's certain percentage of right-wing voters among all the immigrant groups. And I think they are important. And we need to understand that as long as that tendency is there among immigrant populations, the narrative will never be one narrative, right? There will be many different stories that are being told. And I'm interested in stories, as you know, because I write about stories. So I'm interested in their story as well. And this is why I've been doing some work on this right now. I'm interested in the story that they tell of themselves, because they have to make it somehow make sense.
Are you doing it systematically, trying to compare migrants that tilt left to migrants who tilt right? Or are you, what?
Well, as you know, I'm not a sociologist, and I have sociologist friends who are doing that work. So I'm drawing on their work simply. They're doing the data analysis. I'm doing the kind of literary analysis of stories and texts. And the texts to me are really very interesting, because I like to read between the lines of text and see kind of what is the story you tell and what is the story you cannot tell or you refuse to tell. And the story you refuse to tell is just as interesting as the story you tell. So the story you tell might be that, look at me, I'm Korean American, I've come here, I've done well, look at my beautiful house, look at all the houses that I rent to other people, look at my business, look at my small business, and so on and so forth. But in the putting up of the sign, what are you also saying? You're saying, I've gotten this certain status, and this status allows me to vote in my interest. And my interest are my taxes, and I do not want to pay these taxes. And my interest is private schools, because that's where my children go. They go to the best Atlanta private schools. I mean, this is what you're saying. You're saying, I've gone to a point where I don't have to worry about other people. I get to just worry about myself. And that, I think, is the message. That's how I interpret the message.
Okay. You actually have the makings of a very fine politician, a very dynamic politician. I don't know whether you have aspirations along those lines, but I kind of would like to.
Who knows? But I think one thing I've really thought a lot about in Georgia is that, the way this administration, but even before this administration, sadly, this was going on under Obama as well, has treated immigrants and illegal immigrants has been the most horrific and the most inhuman possible. And the fact that immigrant populations are not up in arms, protesting this treatment, to me, is also one of the most disturbing things about migrant life that I have encountered.
Wait a minute. Now you're saying that this was going on. It wasn't just under the
because
you're not naming, but it was under Obama too.
Yes, because Obama was known among immigrant populations as deporter in chief, right? Yeah. I mean, he was deporting, he was imprisoning, the number of detainees, basically detained in inhuman conditions. Far too many people within a prison, kept denied all access to their loved ones, denied access to proper meals. Obviously it's a system that is corrupt, and there's not one person we can blame. But what I'm saying is that immigrants have not been treated very well, especially in Georgia, because we are actually home to some of the largest prisons of immigrant detainees. And the fact that, you have these immigrants who are doing so well and who are prospering, and at the same time who somehow are so removed, who at least mentally are able to say, that's not me. Like, that's not my problem. Yes, you can say this is a human problem and all humans should be worried about it. But the fact that you can be an immigrant and no longer feel any kind of identification with someone else who has come under dire conditions, no matter the reasons, under difficult conditions and is now being treated in human ways, and that you can just kind of let them sit there.
Well,
To
but
me, that's really disturbing.
again, that doesn't bode well for your prospects under Biden's administration. If Obama wasn't all that great, then is there any reason to think Biden is going to be different? Or I don't know whether you want to pin it on them personally, Biden the man and Obama the man, or just the people around them. Is there any reason to expect that because of the big anti-immigrant action under the Trump presidency, that there will be a reaction that will be much more favorable to immigrants now, or
I like I said, I want to be the optimist and I want to be hopeful. And I think we are so starved for hope at this point after the last administration that I have to think it can only be better. But am I confident that Biden and his administration will bring kind of huge systemic change, which is the kind of change we need? I'm not so sure. At the local level, I am a big fan of Stacey Abrams. I'm really hoping she will be governor in 2022. I think I put more faith in her. And in some ways, the American system is such that really, I think at the state level is where so much is done and can be done. And certainly in terms of our prisons in Georgia, I would think that somebody like Stacey Abrams would attend to the human rights crisis we're in ways that I'm not sure Biden would, you know. And I'm sensitive to Obama's, the ways in which he was blocked, you know, right, left, and center every time he tried to make any kind of change. And I'm sure Biden will be too, even with our recent Georgia victories. Everything will be a challenge for him.
Yeah.
Any sweeping change will be, I think, blocked by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope that the scandal, the last few days will change the dynamics in a significant way too, because I think the Republicans are fragmenting. We're going to
They're all jumping ship right now.
Well, yeah, enough of them to make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
How many of them, what fraction? I think it'll be very interesting. I think within the next few days, we'll have a pretty good idea of how many people are going to go down with the ship.
Yes.
And hope it goes down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Look, I should move on. We both have a full day ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say how delightful it is to talk to you.
Thank you. It's a delight to talk to you. And I'm very grateful to you too. I mean, I want to also put this out there into the ethosphere that you were one of the people who welcomed my family as immigrants and as refugees. And I know you've done this for lots of people. We are just one among so many you've helped. But that, I was thinking to myself before meeting you today, that I think you were my first real Canadian white adult who I knew. And I think that's huge when you think about childhood and the kind of impact people make on you and how they shape who you are, and they shape your dreams, and they shape your ambitions. And I think, I was thinking to myself, like, I became an academic, and really there are no academics in my family, but Metta is an academic, and who knows? I mean, maybe you were my inspiration. I never really thought about it that way, but it occurred to me today.
Well, I really would love to take credit for you. Good, I'll claim all the credit. It's wonderful, and I'm just really happy for you and for your family. Thanks. Bless you, dear. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.